to what extent is there unity and diversity, and to what extent does the unity come, or does it lead to a uniformity at the expense of a diversity? And to what extent does the diversity become a division at the expense of unity? You'll see that among the Eastern Orthodox churches today, they all use the Byzantine rite, with the exception of some maybe 40 parishes in the US and a handful in France, and a few other places where they follow a modified version of a Western liturgy, either from the Book of Common Prayer or a slightly retouched version of the Tridentine, the extraordinary form of the Mass. But basically, everybody uses the Byzantine rite. That is the Greek Christians in Alexandria, to the Antiochian Orthodox, to Ukrainian Orthodox, to those in Japan and Finland and what have you. Now, that unity that they have in worship, yes, there's different languages, different chant traditions, different cultural traditions, but the fact is they nonetheless share the same text, 95% overlap of the text they use for their worship and the rubrics that they use for whether for the Mass, the sacraments, the divine liturgy, the sacraments, the liturgy of the hours, and what have you. Now, many people would say that's a strength. It's a wonderful thing that Orthodox from Japan to Finland to Fiji or South Africa can go in and experience the same liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and even when the language or chant is different, they understand the structure is the same. And I'm not saying that that's not a good thing, but it's not obvious that that's the way it would have to be. Because in fact, the Greeks in Alexandria used to worship according to the liturgies used by the Coptic Church today. The Greek-speaking Christians in Antioch used to worship according to the liturgies that are used by the Syriac Orthodox today, right? But over time, as you'll see in the lectures and the readings, they were Byzantinized, right? They were homogenized in order to demonstrate their solidarity with one another and their loyalty to the imperial church, and at that time also to the papacy, that the church that sponsored the ecumenical councils. So there, in various times, you see this a movement that is either centrifugal, right, fleeing the center, or centripetal, seeking the center, whatever you might perceive that center to be. And even in, say, the case of Ukrainian Christianity today, you see an interesting, tension between how different Ukrainian Orthodox, Ukrainian Catholics, and say Moscow Patriarchate Ukrainian Orthodox, right? So, Ukrainians who are part of the Moscow Patriarchate, Ukrainians who are part of the, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine now, and Ukrainian Catholics, who in principle share not only the same Byzantine liturgy, but the same Ukrainian cultural context. But there are very noticeable differences, once you're familiar with it, as you know, if you go into Ukrainian Catholic or Ukrainian Orthodox or, Moscow Patriarchate parish, not because people feel the need to accentuate one thing, suppress something else, demonstrate a loyalty or a solidarity with one other part of the church through having adopted their practices or making reference to them in some way, and so forth. So this is actually very, very complex, and it's part of the exciting thing of studying ritual generally, is to sort of be always attentive to these dynamics of how culture and worship are always in relating or influencing one another, and it's never static, it's always dynamic. The Byzantine rite, as crystallized and as stable as it may appear, especially to people from a Western background where there's been, and there is always an ongoing process of liturgical change, reform, deform maybe, change of some kind. Even there in the East, there is change, always change afoot, not only outside of the traditional homelands of these churches, but in their original context as well. And I hope that by the end of the course, you'll all be more sensitive to this in a way that's not unlike the sensitivity one can acquire when you, say, as an Anglophone, go to South Africa and maybe go to Scotland, and maybe go to Hong Kong and go to Mumbai. And you can hear people speaking English in all of those places, but not only with a different accent, but even with a slightly different vocabulary, right? And a different phraseology and a different set of metaphors and similes and so forth, even if they're speaking the same language. It begs the question, at what point does a dialect become a language in its own right, right? How far can one go in distinguishing oneself before the unity that one had with another body is no longer evident? This is in fact the very challenge that those Western Rite Orthodox who I mentioned face, because the ritual that they want to use, whether it's from a modified form of Anglican or Episcopalian worship or that of the classical form of the Roman Rite, is so at odds with what 99.9% of other Orthodox do and know and love, that those Orthodox find it very difficult to recognize the Western Rite Orthodox as Orthodox. They walk into their church and it doesn't make any sense to them, and they're immediately suspicious that these people, and not only ordinary people, but even many theologians would have critiqued this Western Rite movement. They would say, if you're using these Western forms, how on earth can you be certain you're not also adopting the mindset, and that is the heresies of the Western Christians who also use these forms and are not in communion with the Orthodox Church? And a not dissimilar dynamic has historically existed in the Catholic Church vis-a-vis the Eastern Catholic churches, right? Which is why we were also Latinized, all of our churches at various points, because both from the side of the Latins, who said, well, if you guys are really Catholic, surely you also do the rosary. Surely you also have exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. Surely you also use unleavened bread. Surely you also have an all celibate and so forth. They felt the need to exert pressure to bring about a greater homogeneity. From the side of the Eastern Catholics, they felt the pressure to both distinguish themselves from their fellow Orthodox by saying that we're Eastern Catholics, and also demonstrate to Roman Catholics that we were in fact in good standing. So this process, it ebbs and flows. And as I said, there's a dynamic at one point that's centripetal and one point centrifugal. Prior to the Second Vatican Council, the dynamic among Eastern Catholics was to seek the center, was to emulate whatever was Roman practice. I say, prior really to the 20th century, it began to be undone to a certain extent then, but was certainly exploded after the Second Vatican Council. We now have a centrifugal dynamic where different Eastern churches are seeking, they're fleeing the center in a way, seeking rapprochement with their Orthodox counterparts, or for example, in the case of the Syro-Malabar Church, who have no substantial Orthodox counterpart, are seeking to a greater level of baptizing Indian culture, right? And so Hindu aesthetic, Hindu music, chanting, and art and architecture, ascetical practices, and so forth. The Syro-Malabar are experimenting with how to make their church more Indian, less Latin, still Syrian, but more Indian, while preserving the Syrian liturgy, East Syrian liturgy, and their communion with Rome. They're trying to become more local and more contextual. So, and that raises all sorts of interesting questions. So I'll invite you to, keep that in mind, really, if you are come out of this thinking more, in a more nuanced manner about the relationship of religion and culture, of ritual and popular customs, that will be, that will be a success.